Hello, dear learners. Welcome to another video session of the MOOC titled Rural Development in India. In this session, we shall discuss the Unit 3 of Module 1, and the title of the unit is Rural Demography in India. Dear learners, we all know that demography is a systematic study of human population. Different scholars have defined demography in various ways. According to Bartley, the numerical portrayal of human population is known as demography. According to Hosser and Duncan, demography is the study of the size, territorial distribution, and composition of rural population, changes therein, and the components of such changes, which may be identified as natality, mortality, territorial movement, social mobility, so on and so forth. Therefore, by demography, we mean the scientific and statistical study of population, and in particular the size of the various types of population, their development and structure, so on and so forth. Dear learners, population is utmost important for any human society. For every society, the birth and death of individuals are crucial for its existence, survival, and development. Therefore, demographic processes and demographic phenomenon have been of keen interest to all men since time immemorial. Gradually, with the evolution of human society, it became important to keep records of human population for administrative purposes and also for formulating policies and programs for human welfare, as well as to ameliorate socio-economic problems associated with population. The importance and significance of demography as an area of study is increasing manifold in the contemporary times because of its relevance for administrators, policymakers, and scholars studying about population dynamics. Modern nation building depends on developing human resources and organizing human activities effectively. Human development is essential for all forms of progress, be it social, political, cultural, economic, so on and so forth. Since developmental planning is ultimately for people, therefore, accurate and adequate information about population size, growth, composition, and quality becomes very, very crucial. For example, when deciding how many schools or hospitals are needed in a particular area, the data on population's age, population size, sex, etc. is very, very necessary. And this is why, demography is very important. Studying population or having data on population is very, very important. Dear learners, in this video session, we shall try to discuss about the demographic structure, about the population structure of the rural areas in India. We will discuss about the population growth in rural areas, the fertility and the mortality trends, the age structure, the sex structure, the occupation, literacy, so on and so forth. And this discussion will enable you to get an overview of what comprises the demographic structure, or what comprises the demographic structure of the rural areas. What is the population pattern in the rural areas of India. So, this session will provide you an overview of the size, composition, and the growth of rural population, along with the related issues of contemporary times, such as migration, so on and so forth. Now, dear learners, we know that rural India continues to play a pivotal role in the country's demographic landscape. Why? Because even in the 2001 census, we have seen that the majority of Indian population still resides in the rural areas. We have been hearing of urbanization over the period of time. There has been growing urbanization. People have been migrating from rural to urban areas. But despite this increasing urbanization, a significant majority of India's population still resides in its countryside, in its rural areas. According to 2011 census, 833 million Indians live in rural areas, which is more than two-thirds of its total population. If you see the rural urban distribution, you'll see that 68.8% of Indians reside in rural areas while only 31.2% resides in the urban areas. These populations are shaped by specific demographic characteristics, social structures, and demographic challenges that are essential to understand for policy and planning. Now, you may be wondering why we need to study about demography in rural development. Dear learners, studying and understanding about rural demography is very, very essential because demographic patterns shape almost every aspect of rural life, planning, and policy. Rural areas often have unique population characteristics such as aging populations, youth migration, lower population density, higher dependency ratios, so on and so forth. And knowing these patterns and characteristics would help us understand who lives in rural areas, what their needs are, or what the people in the rural areas need, for example in terms of healthcare, education, jobs, housing, so on and so forth, and how do these needs differ from that of the urban population. And therefore, understanding demography helps students of rural development, helps the planners, the policymakers, understand the rural demographics, understand the population patterns, understand the composition of rural areas. And this, helps in, especially for policymakers, this helps in planning and designing targeted and effective rural policies such as employment schemes, social welfare programs, healthcare services, so on and so forth. Many rural problems such as poverty, unemployment, food insecurity, low literacy rate are also closely linked to its demographic factors. Demographic analysis, therefore, helps us identify why these issues exist and how to address these issues and problems. Thus, rural demography basically gives us the factual foundation needed to understand rural communities and helps the policymakers and planners to plan effectively and address the problems at their roots and implement meaningful rural development strategies. So, dear learners, we have discussed about why rural development or why demography is important for rural development, or why an understanding of demography is important for effective rural development. What is demography, so on and so forth. We have tried to understand this, and now let us try to understand a rural demography in details. While doing so, we shall first try to understand the size and distribution of rural population in India. The total population, if you see the census of 2011, India's population is around 1.2 billion, and rural population, as we have mentioned ago, and rural population, as we have already mentioned, is 833.09 million, which is 68.8% of the total Indian population. Between 2001 and 2011, rural population has increased by 90.4 million. But interestingly, urban population grew by 91 million. That is, slightly higher than the growth of urban population. So urbanization rose from 27.81% in 2001 to 31.16% in 2011. While the share of rural population has declined from 72.19% in 2001 to 68.84% in 2011. So we have seen that rural population is gradually declining. In terms of states, Uttar Pradesh has the largest share of, rural population. Now, coming to population density, rural population, is unevenly distributed, just as in the case of urban areas. And it is this unevenness of distribution that is a significant feature of India's rural population. The factors that have guided the distribution pattern of population are the availability of cultivable land, depth and fertility of soil, depth of underground water table, availability of water for irrigation, natural resources, so on and so forth. And depending on these factors, the density of population varies from place to place. Now, coming to the demographic characteristics of rural population, we have just mentioned that while comparing the 2001 and 2011 census, we have seen that the decadal growth of rural population is only 12.18%, which is significantly lower than the previous decades. While, in contrast to this, urban areas grew much faster, that is, 31.8% in that particular decade. So we have, if you observe the census reports, or if you look at the census reports, you'll see that the growth in the rural population in India has been declining steadily since 1991. And this trend can result from various factors such as lower birth rates due to better access in education, family planning, improved health care, and changing socio-economic conditions. Additionally, large-scale migration from rural to urban areas for jobs, education, and better economic opportunities reduces the pace of rural population growth. Overall, the decline in the rural population growth often reflects social development, increased awareness, and shifting economic patterns in the rural regions. Now, coming to the age structure of the rural population, the 2011 census noted a large population in the 0 to 6 age group. That is, rural children aged 0 to 6 accounted for 117.6 million, while urban children of the same age cohort were only 41.2 million. Now, this indicates that, rural areas in India have a very, very young population structure, which also implies a higher dependency ratio, especially when many children are dependent on the working adults for support. Now, coming to the sex ratio in rural areas, dear learners, one of the significant aspects of demographic dynamics in the rural society, or in any society for that matter, is the sex ratio. It is an important social indicator used to measure the extent of prevailing equity between males and females in a society at a given point in time. It is an outcome mainly of the interplay of sex differentials in mortality, sex selective migration, sex ratio at birth, and at times the sex differentials in population enumeration. Now, if we see the census records, we'll find that visibility of women has increased, and it is evident from the increase or improvement in sex ratio in both rural and urban areas of the country. In 2011, the overall sex ratio in India was 943. Rural sex ratio is still better, that is 949, while urban sex ratio was 929. For the 0 to 6 years age group, rural sex ratio has improved from 906 in 2001 to 923 in 2011. This improvement in sex ratio reflects positive social changes such as better health care for women, reduced gender discrimination, increased awareness about female rights, and declining female infant mortality. It often indicates progress in rural development, as a balanced or rising sex ratio is linked to improved living conditions, access to medical facilities, and changing attitudes towards the value of girls. However, Despite these improvements, child sex ratio remains a concern. For example, in various states of our country, this child sex ratio is very very poor, or various states have much lower child sex ratios. Dear learners, let us now discuss about fertility, mortality and health of the rural population. We have already mentioned that rural population growth has been declining over the decades, and this slowdown in the rural population growth suggests of decline in the fertility rates in the rural areas. Historically, if we see, rural areas generally have higher fertility rates due to various factors such as early marriage, limited access to contraception, lower levels of female education, and cultural preferences for larger families, so on and so forth. However, with the increasing awareness, education, healthcare access, rural fertility rates have been gradually declining. The sex ratio improvement among the 0 to 6 age group in rural areas may also reflect better survival for girls, though it could also be influenced by undercounting, reporting, or social changes. The sex ratio for the 60 plus age groups in 2011 was 1,033, indicating more elderly women than men. Various studies have shown that the health infrastructure and maternal child health in rural areas remains highly challenged. Mortality rates tends to be higher in rural regions because of limited healthcare facilities, poor sanitation, malnutrition, and lower awareness about health practices. Child and maternal mortality have traditionally been high in rural areas, though they have been improving with time with better medical services, immunization programs, and government health initiatives. Now, coming to literacy and education in rural areas, the overall literacy rate in India in 2011 was 74.04%. In rural areas, total literacy rate is 68.91%, and in urban areas it is 84.98%. For males in the rural areas it is 78.57%, and in urban areas it is 89.69%. For females in the rural areas 58.75%, and urban areas 79.92%. Though female literacy rate in rural areas is still lower, as in comparison to its male counterparts, and in the urban areas also we see the same trend. However, if we compare the 2001 and 2011 census, we will see an increase in female literacy rate in rural areas. In 2001 it was 46.13%, and in 2011 it is 58.75%. So we have seen a considerable increase in female literacy. But nevertheless, gender gap in literacy rate remains still today, though it has reduced both in the rural and urban areas. Though literacy rates have improved, the rural-urban literacy gap remains significant. Rural literacy lags behind the urban levels. And when we talk about female literacy, female literacy in rural areas is notably lower than male literacy. Same is the case with the urban areas also, and it contributes to slower demographic transitions in some regions. Limited access to schools, poor educational infrastructure, higher dropout rates, economic pressures that push children into work, and lower awareness about the importance of education, so on and so forth, are the reasons why we still have lower levels of literacy rates. Again, cultural factors, especially gender-based barriers, also reduce literacy rates among rural women. Therefore, although literacy levels in the rural areas have been improving with government schemes and awareness, they still lag behind the urban literacy rates. Now, coming to occupational structure and livelihood, various studies and surveys have shown that rural livelihoods still revolve around agriculture, allied sectors like livestock and fisheries, and informal labor in manufacturing, construction, so on and so forth. The significant rural population, that is 833 million, it implies, that a vast workforce of the rural population, or of the total population in the country for that matter, are engaged in agriculture and allied sectors. Majority of them work as cultivators, agricultural laborers, or, informal low income jobs. Non-farm activities like small-scale industries, handicrafts, constructions and rural services are growing but still limited. Livelihoods in rural areas often depend on seasonal and unstable employment, leading to income insecurity. Limited access to modern technology, credit, market opportunities, etc., further restricts economic growth. However, government schemes, rural development programs, and diversification into non farm sectors are gradually improving livelihood opportunities and reducing dependence on agriculture alone. Now, coming to migration and mobility, the Census 2011 report shows that urban population growth has outpaced the rural population growth during the decade, and this suggests an increasing migration from rural to urban areas. In the recent decades, migration from rural areas to urban areas have increased significantly. Studies suggest that many people have moved from rural areas to the towns and cities in search of better jobs, higher wages, improved education, access to healthcare, so on and so forth. Further, agricultural challenges such as small land holdings, low productivity, and dependence on seasonal work have also pushed people to look for stable income elsewhere. A large part of this migration is seasonal, with workers moving temporarily for construction, factory work, and other service sector jobs. Over time, this trend has led to declining rural populations in some regions, labor shortages in farming, and social changes within rural families and communities. At the same time, remittances from migrants have become an important source of income for rural households. Now, this migration from rural to urban areas significantly contributes to changes in the rural demographic patterns. It contributes to reducing the working age population in the villages. Sending remittances back to the rural households improves rural living standards, and this migration also, influences social structures, leading to changes in, the social structures in both the place of origin and the destination areas. Now, coming to social composition of rural areas, dear learners, rural areas are often organized around traditional social hierarchies, with caste playing a major role in determining status, occupation, and access to resources. Scheduled caste, scheduled tribes, other backward classes, and upper caste groups commonly form the social landscape of rural areas. According to 2011 census, scheduled caste numbered around 201.4 million and scheduled tribes around 104.3 million. And a significant portion of the scheduled caste and scheduled tribe population live in the rural areas, thereby contributing to the demographic character of the villages. Social stratification based on this caste and tribe affects access to land resources, inequalities in education and economic opportunities, and development outcomes in rural India. However, over time, modernization, migration, education, and government policies have brought gradual changes, reducing some traditional barriers and promoting social mobility. Dear learners, let us now discuss about the infrastructure services and human development in the rural areas. Studies have shown that rural demographic features reflect infrastructural constraints. The high proportion of rural population indicates the need or indicates the continued demand for basic services and infrastructural facilities like healthcare, education, drinking water, sanitation, electricity, so on and so forth. But in many regions, especially the remote areas, one still encounters infrastructural constraints. Many rural areas still lack adequate health, educational, and other infrastructural facilities. Despite various government infrastructure development and welfare measures, people still have to rush to nearest towns, cities for this healthcare, education, and other facilities. So, the rural areas, considering the vast size of population it holds, there is the need for better and more infrastructural facilities for the welfare and development of rural population. Then, gender imbalances, especially in the 0 to 6 age group, in the rural areas, it points towards, regressive social norms that are still prevalent in our society. And also, it points towards the need for better maternal and child health care services in rural areas. So, dear learners, with this, we have, tried to understand the rural demographic features, its population growth, its sex structure, its age structure, its literacy levels, occupational structure, the kind of infrastructural constraints that rural areas have, so on and so forth. And we hope that you have got an overview of the demographic features in the rural areas of our country. And if we consider the 2011 data, we see certain trends and implications. Let us discuss them in brief. The data from 2011 shows that there is a slowing population growth or decline in population growth in rural areas. Then we see improving sex ratio in rural areas, but there is again persistent gender imbalances in certain states of the country. Then we have then population data also reveals that rural population is very very young, because there are a large number of children in the rural areas, and this will create a kind of pressure, continued pressure for schooling, childcare, and future employment. Then population data also reveals that there is a significant trend or growing trend towards rural urban migration, and this growing migration suggests or implies that cities will increasingly absorb rural workforce, but also this calls for greater infrastructural development in the cities. And also we the planners and policymakers need to ensure that, because people are migrating to urban areas, we cannot neglect infrastructural developments in the rural areas. And finally, the population overview of the rural areas or the demographic features of rural areas calls for an increasing need for inclusive policies and infrastructural development. 2/3 of India's population resides in the villages. It is a vast majority of population who lives in the countryside, and then therefore we need adequate infrastructure, because in the rural areas still today we have seen that there is large size of population on one hand, but again there is lack of adequate infrastructure on the other hand. So this gap needs to be addressed, this gap needs to be fulfilled. So this calls for infrastructure development in the rural areas, thereby ensuring welfare and development of rural population. So, with 833 million people living in the rural areas, constituting nearly 69% of the national population, rural India remains central to India's demographic and development story. The slowing growth, improving sex ratio among children, and ongoing rural urban migration points towards a transforming countryside. It indicates that there is transformation of the demographic patterns in the rural areas. There is social change in the rural areas. However, these demographic shifts and transformations also at the same time highlights deep challenges in terms of infrastructure, social equity, and human development. And all of these needs to be addressed to ensure a balanced and inclusive growth. Dear learners, we hope that you have understood and got an overview of the rural population and demographic features of the rural areas in India. And we hope to see you again in the next video. Thank you.